All right, let's get started. Thank you for joining this morning, this afternoon. Sorry if there was any issues with your or my timing. I apologize. I don't know what this is going to look like in terms of this format. I see a lot of people's their pictures. So feel free to join with your, hey Nika, with your picture of yourself, or whatever you feel most comfortable with. Yes, hi, put your microphones on. Let's chat. I don't know. I think it would be helpful for me. I have I'm doing different things here. I'm trying new things, especially because the whole Zoom technology feels really just like disconnected. So I've got a whiteboard with some stuff. I'm really like utilizing all of my children's resources here. So we'll see what I can do to make it interesting and to have a good conversation today. So my idea for today is to throw some ideas, some concepts at you, some food for thought as you think about ways to incorporate the sort of overarching concept of LGBTQ or sexual gender minorities in your classroom, in your curriculum, in various sort of ways. So I've got some things I've jotted down on my little whiteboard, and then I also shared with you, this is kind of I'm calling it like the primer, the module primer, if you're going to do a section on LGBTQ topics. It could look like this. This is how I'm sort of approaching my pedagogy in the fall, rather than doing like a class by class. I think I'm really going to be doing modules and sort of focusing. So you can pick and choose from that. I have some content there for you to include in your own teaching. So feel free to take that. Okay, so actually I want to start out by watching this together. Let's see. Just the trailer for one of these, because I think it maybe sets the tone a little bit for, let's see if I can do screen sharing effectively here. Portion of screen, basic. Let's go desktop 2. All right, so let's just take a moment and watch the trailer for this. This is We Were Here. Again, thinking about how we might incorporate this topic in our curriculum. Okay.
If you had a bus ticket, it better be saying San Francisco, because that was the place to come.
I think a lot of us here because we didn't quite.
Erica, we're not seeing the video.
Oh, got it. Okay.
I like it.
Thank you. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. It's because I didn't hit the button.
Oh.
Okay.
Yep, there it is.
There it is. Okay, cool. Thank you.
If you had a bus ticket, it better be saying San Francisco, because that was the place to come.
I think a lot of us came out here because we didn't quite fit where we were.
I like the people here. They just seem more open. And I always wanted to meet a nice blonde surfer. Young men and said, have as much sex as you can have. How much sex would they have? Sex. Was feeling very confident that you could be much more sexual, and that was okay. '81 was a big year. That is when everything changed. I remember looking in the window of Star Pharmacy, and there were these little Polaroid photographs. Watch out, guys, there's something out there. The first time I heard about AIDS, I think it was called the gay cancer. We had friends who were dying right at the beginning of the epidemic.
I was hanging blood one day in the hospital, and the infectious disease fellow came in and said, Eileen, why don't you put gloves on? We don't know what this is.
How are you getting it? Who are you getting it from? Who's giving it to who?
Everybody was reading the obituaries because they went from like this to like this. principal response was food banks and care programs. And it was a response that America should be proud of.
It changed people's view of the gay community in a huge way.
Again and again, in every situation, there's lesbians there leading the fight.
None of my friends are around from the beginning. So I want to tell their story as much as I want to tell my story.
Okay, let's see. Share. Your screen share. Okay. Do you see me now?
I still also see the video.
Oh, you see the video too? Okay, let's see. Stop share. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so I sort of threw us into the late 70s, 80s, and I totally recognize that history there is a history before this, and there are many sort of different historical points that we could talk about. But I think one of the things we need to tease out when we're talking about activism and sexual and gender minorities is thinking about sort of multiple levels of complexity in terms of acceptability of human lives. And so certainly the 80s is a point we can talk about in our teaching and our pedagogy and looking at sort of different moments of resistance. We can certainly go back in time too, and there's other examples in the primer for you that you can sort of start from. So maybe you can start from Stonewall and some of the other sort of social uprisings that were happening in the sort of end of the 1950s and the 1960s. There's Compton's Cafeteria, and that I can provide more resources for you if you want more examples that are sort of pre-Stonewall. But I think Stonewall is a good anchoring point for thinking about sexual and gender minorities and thinking about the coalescing of groups of people and their use of media, their use of public relations in uprising and resistance. So I think that's a good starting point. And I've got some resources for you in that document I shared with you. Okay, so I think the sort of ultimate goal for our conversation today is to think about the ways that PR sort of teaching might come at LGBTQ identities and issues. And I totally recognize that identities are multiple and overlapping and complex and intersectional. So I don't mean to suggest that, any other identities are sort of less valid, but in this sort of context, I just want to be focusing and thinking about sort of the primacy of sort of sexuality or gender identity and what we can do with that in public relations. Does that make sense? Cool. Please feel free to jot down any questions in the chat or, unmute yourself and ask at this point. What questions or areas would you like me to sort of focus on?
Okay, so I've got a language question to start with.
Yeah.
So you keep using sexual and gender minorities as a term, right?
Yep.
As opposed to like LGBTQ plus in addition to that term?
Sure.
Are they interchangeable? Like, how are you using that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one of the questions I was going to I should have started with, is that terminology is historical and it's contextual. Okay.
Right.
So if we're talking about, so I think it's important just to be upfront with our students and recognize that language is historical, language is fluid and kinetic. And so, maybe we might not get it right. Maybe our students use various identity categories that might be new to us. So sort of bridging that. So yeah, that's a great question, Melissa. I've started using sexual and gender minorities in my research because the acronym might not necessarily work for all the things I'm talking about or teaching about. especially in thinking about my students. I have many students who sort of fit under the umbrella of queer. And so that's a terminology that is also historical, that is also a form of resistance. So I can sort of recommend some other stuff for you to think about. All right, so here's a real public relations sort of question. There are brands and organizations that might be really resistant to using the term and the term queer in their communication materials, right? Because they don't know how to, they don't know if they should. Whereas there might be other sort of health or nonprofit organizations who are super comfortable, super fluent in using that language. So I think it's just important to sort of talk about language and to think about language in a public relations perspective as it relates to maybe your client, maybe it relates to your audience, your organization, or whatever that might be. So really grounding it in the context, I think, is important. Other questions about language and terminology. We can treat this conversation like a Vegas thing, like, hey, I have no idea, maybe one thing is like, there's increasing conversation around like gender diversity. What does that look like in the PR classroom or the PR curriculum, right? Like it could be like an elephant. We're not really sure what to make sense of.
Right. Relatedly, and then I see that Nika maybe also wants to jump in. I've been doing some reading lately about like the idea of queer as like a not just perhaps a sexual or a gender expression, but also as like a political term.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And so like I think that's a really interesting thing to maybe add into as we're thinking about like what terminology are we using. I've been reading some stuff from people that have been like, don't use queer if you're not like coming at it from a political perspective. So yeah, more food for thought.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think I linked in this document to the article that I wrote for PR, Journal of Public Relations Research, Queering PR. And I talk about I give a little bit about the background of the language around the word queer and what it means. And it has come to mean different things across time, but Melissa, you're totally on point there with this idea that originally queer started out as a sort of a reclamation word that took on and has much political connotation. It's very much of a resistance, a terminology of resistance, an identity of resistance, a politics of resistance, which fits exactly with what we've been talking about in this idea of our activism and PR. So thank you for bringing that up, for sure. Other thoughts, other questions?
Just was going to ask, I'm not muted. I was going to ask another question related to Melissa's about language. So language is always tricky, but I'm one for fluidity when possible. So I was wondering, is it okay to use different terms, or like, would you counsel someone to use different terms based on the audience that they were addressing and what they were talking about, rather than trying to find the exact one term that is there a universal, or is it better to think of it in terms of plurality?
Yes, I would always err on the side of plurality. I mean, okay, maybe not always. I don't want to be reductive in that way.
That would be universal.
Yeah. But in this case, I would say plurality. I was going to give you an example, and now I'm sort of blanking. But yes, here's my example. It's from our own research together, Nika. It's this idea that it depends on your audience, like in what knowledge and what familiarity they bring to their encountering of the communication materials that they might be facing, right? So if you are trying to change public opinion about a certain issue, you need to meet your audience sort of at the moment of lowest common denominator, right? And so there's certain language, certain rhetoric, certain imagery that may be alienating for that audience. There's multiple sort of, and I think understanding your audience is at the sort of the fundamental, for sure. Yeah. And in our particular project, Nika and I are sort of theorizing about queer of color practitioners, particularly trans and gender diverse folks who work in communication, doing public relations work, and thinking about, you know, their audiences. What are they trying to achieve? And often that sort of is the driver of the language and of the messaging itself, right? Am I intending to be provocative? If so, here are my sort of arsenal of imagery and tools, etc. But if the intent is to sort of move the needle on a political issue where you want people to turn out to vote in November on a particular measure, the approach you take will be different, right? So yeah, thank you for that question. I appreciate that. Other questions around terminology? Okay. So I think the history, so I have history as sort of my next one. I'm not going to give you a historical overview. I think there are a sufficient amount of resources out there that can help provide your students with a context. Often what they know of LGBTQ issues and sort of things are grounded in the contemporary. Certainly I don't want to assume they don't know anything about history, but it's good to sort of provide some of the historical context. So I've shared, I can sort of, let me do a video, a screen share here for a second of this. See. So further off the straight and narrow, let's see if it pulls it up here. So this is a really great documentary. It features a lot of media and communication scholars. So you could just assign this, it's an hour documentary. If you're doing a module on understanding audiences or something like that, or you're doing a specific section on LGBTQ, this is great. It provides a nice historical sort of overview of entertainment and news media. There is an original called Off the Straight and Narrow, which is more about the AIDS crisis. So you could assign both of them if you wanted to. Students are going to complain that it's outdated, but that's fine because they know about the contemporary. So this is an opportunity to give them more about the past. What else do I recommend? How to Survive a Plague. That one's very informative around HIV and AIDS, which my students haven't historically sort of had too much familiarity with. So if you're doing some of the historical things, a suggestion I have for you is also to pair it with the American Airlines case study that I did in the case studies in strategic communication. That's linked, should be case studies here. It's this one right here from 2016. It does a really nice job sort of, oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't sharing my screen. Gosh, I'm sorry. Okay. This one right here, it does a really nice job of pairing the historical with some really contemporary public relations questions and concerns. Easy to plug that in, but it's important to set our students up with some of that historical information because they might not sort of, you need to prime them with sort of the context before throwing them into getting them to try to think about and grapple with crisis communication in the 1990s amidst an AIDS crisis. You know, they might be able to draw parallels with COVID. It's not the same though if you're thinking about AIDS and you know, gay sort of stigma in the 90s. So I'm a fan of that as a really digestible facet there. Okay. So I think there are some great sort of opportunities there for the historical stuff. Questions about history, or what history to include, what history not to include, whose histories to include.
A question. Do you find students more curious about one particular, like what aspects of history have you found your students are most interested in, and which ones do their eyes glaze over?
Mm-hmm. They like entertainment. They tend to be, you know, the entertainment stuff, the campy stuff, you know, they have a hard time with the less sexy and the less glamorous. So I think that because, you know, sexuality tends to be a taboo in the United States, you can utilize that to your advantage to get them to think about and engage with, do you know what I mean? Like wield the risque in order to get them to think critically about, all right, so we see this imagery, that's really sort of thought-provoking or whatever, right, at the time. So yeah, it's a great question.
Erica, hi, this is Natalie.
Hi, Natalie.
Hi, everybody. Have you looked at or seen the Johnson & Johnson backed documentary on the AIDS crisis, the nurses of the AIDS crisis? It's called 5B. If you've seen it, is that something that you would recommend? Because it's an interesting mix of corporate social responsibility, but also documentary filmmaking. It's a weird hybrid situation, entertainment, documentary hybrid, corporate social responsibility effort, but it was at the Cannes Film Festival. But have you seen that by chance?
No, I haven't. I'm sorry, I can't comment on your question, but I'm gonna bookmark it. And I don't have anything to say about it, but I think it's fantastic as a way for us to get our students to think critically about what happens when a video or a documentary is backed by a company that has a history of questionable, practices with different groups. So let me think more about that.
Yeah. And it really, it came up just because I saw this and I said, I know we were hearing other documentaries frame this through definitely the lens of the people who are actually experiencing, the patients, the people who were there, the sexual gender minorities who were experiencing the crisis. And this comes from a more corporate angle on it. And so it might be an interesting compare and contrast type of thing too. So I was just throwing it out there.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I'm going to add that to my little module list here. That's great. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so that's sort of what I was thinking about in terms of history. What else is on my list here? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the advocacy versus activism component, and I want to tease out a little bit of complexity around those terms and of sort of the way in which the trajectory has moved. Sarah, thank you for it. Sarah, right? You sent me all those resources. Is that right?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm preparing to send that manuscript back out for review by the end of the week. So thank you for helping me really nail down some of those definitional concepts. Okay, so one thing we need to think about, and I think this is relevant for everyone who will be doing one of these little module conversations moving forward and for teaching with our students, is differentiating between advocacy and activism. Often these terms get used interchangeably, and I think we need to trouble that because they are, I understand them to be on a spectrum in terms of action, in terms of ideology. And so we can think of sort of social movements and politics, sort of like the sphere of that, but understanding advocacy is sort of the more conservative approach and activism as the more radical approach. And, we can understand, like we can place, the 5B? Is that right, Natalie? That's what it's called? The documentary and the work done by Johnson & Johnson. We could place that on the spectrum, right? And we can sort of tease out some of these concepts for our students in terms of, does this represent corporate social responsibility? Does it represent brand advocacy? Does it represent brand activism, right? And I'm reviewing lots of papers for journals right now, and those terms get used interchangeably. We need to sort of problematize that, because it does have different implications in terms of thinking about impact and audience and thinking about evaluation and whether, things are working and how we theorize about that and from that. So advocacy is sort of the more conservative sort of approach. activism more radical. What I want to talk about next has to do with the specifically around LGBTQ stuff in the movement of sex, like gays and lesbians in the 1940s, 1950s, sort of being understood as social pariahs, as being understood as, I think that's the right word, as being understood as sort of like deviant, and moving that across time. That's really important to sort of help with our students from understanding how they went from social deviance to target market. And that could be similar to other sort of historically marginalized groups. You can sort of tie that together, but understanding that trajectory, that they haven't always been the rainbow market. It always hasn't been, these corporate pride campaigns and things that we're seeing in 2020, right? We can go back a decade, we can go back 2 decades, 3 decades, and understand the role of advocacy and activism in doing that, and the dangers of that. What happens when we might have a lack of authenticity, a lack of transparency behind that. So lots of things we can tease out around that. So understanding that is important. Any questions about that? Anything I can help sort of bring clarity or light to around that?
I have a question, and this is again, this is Natalie. So if we take it back to social movements and the idea of social movements, does a social movement have to have both components of advocacy and activism, or can it just be one of those? And I'm just asking this theoretically to the group. Do you have to have both components of action, of action and ideology in order for it to be a social movement? I didn't mean to stump anybody. It's just, I'm just asking a question. I'm sorry.
A good question.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, so Natalie, you're asking, so I understand, you're asking, does a social movement need both the advocacy, the more conservative arm, and the activism, the more radical arm, in its sort of work?
Yeah. Because again, whenever I talk about this in class, I always use the ASPCA versus the Animal Liberation Front. You have a conservative effort and you have the more radical effort, but they're not in the same social movement per se together, but they are contrasting organizations. So does a social movement, if we're talking about any civil rights movement or any type of, again, social movement, do we have to have both? Are those components of, are they components of that social movement? Do we need to have both? And this is just a question I've had recently, just thinking about these things. Do we need to have advocacy and activism together, or can we just rely upon one to achieve the ends of legislative change or whatever change we want?
I say you need both, without question. Well, I had a question in the beginning, but the more you talked, I'll just be bold and say, I think you need both, because I think if you have pure activism and no advocacy to translate that activism into conservative or more conservative, I don't mean politically conservative, but I mean just theoretically more conservative, it's that activism is not going to get, it's not going to translate. I think it'll be lost in translation. And then at the same time, I think if you have the advocacy, you have, the most eloquent rhetorical words that have ever been spoken, but there's no action. I think change may come, but it may take so many generations to see it that the situation it was originally addressing has long since passed. So that's my 2 cents.
I'm just going to provide an example here from the topic that I'm responsible for today to give sort of light and clarity to. So during the 1980s, and Eric Sommerfeld has written a lot about sort of ACT UP and Queer Nation, and you can sort of look at that in PR Review. He's got several publications about that. So those are a good place if you're teaching graduate students or you want to assign an undergraduate student that as well. One of the most radical forms of activism I can think of is sort of the die-ins that were being held. People would just sort of, carry coffins through the street, or they would, lie in the streets. And I think of that, but I also contrast it with the more conservative work that was coming out of that time, which was sort of was paving the road for same-sex marriage, because the roots of sort of same-sex marriage had to do with people losing their access to their partner's healthcare, or their partner's wealth, or their partner's resources, or whatever that is, right? So on the one hand, we can see sort of them happening at the same time, and I think this can be seen with all social movements, as Nika mentioned. But again, if you want to give your students examples from sort of the LGBTQ space, those provide some really concrete examples that bring it to light.
No, that's very helpful. So thank you.
I also think if we're thinking about social movements as trying to persuade people, right, or sort of move people from one point to another, I think you need both, because I think you're going to have people who are, I'm going to use the word activated, although I don't think that's right, activated at like lots of different points along the spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. So like you're going to have people who are like, I'm going to go back to Natalie's animal example just because I'm more familiar with it, right? Like you're going to have people who are like, sure, like that Sarah McLachlan song like really hit me in my feels, so like I can give $3 a month to the animals. And you're going to have the Animal Liberation Front, or like maybe more extreme areas of PETA or whatever, who are like, yes, I'm willing to go throw red paint on a fur coat, right? Like, and a social movement kind of needs all of those things in order to get enough energy and enough momentum. I don't know, the words are not right, but you know what I mean, right? To get enough to actually move something forward, to get new legislation, to pass new laws, to actually bring about change. So yeah, I think you need both.
And I think that's a great way to think about it too, those two components, activism versus advocacy. I think that's a great way to think about this particular context, gender minorities. And tell me the other one, because to be, what did you say? You said
sexual and gender minorities. So sexual, really thinking about like gay and lesbian versus, not versus, but like trans and gender diverse folks, right? Because, and that's another thing. That's another thing I've sort of come into think about more and recognize, is that the sort of trans and gender fluid or gender diverse sort of space is something that our students increasingly are either identifying as or want to think more about, maybe depending on where you teach. So they might be super sort of well versed in like the lesbian, gay, bisexual space, or they think it's really like mom, grandma like language that's not relevant to them anymore, right? And so understanding that if you're thinking about audiences, thinking about publics, that kind of thing, there's some good resources for that, and incorporating that in AP style and writing, and how would you cover, a particular issue or conversation or things like that. And I have an article if you are looking for things like, okay, like maybe my students are really interested in trans and gender diverse kind of stuff. I just had an article come out in PR Inquiry where it's an in-depth interview with Caitlyn Jenner's publicist, and looking at the role of the man behind the woman, the role of public relations and publicity in rolling out her transition, for better or worse, right? She's like a really loaded celebrity Kardashian character. We know that. But so I'm not sort of praising her or her politics or any of that, but it's looking at sort of the role the publicist plays in that. So again, lots of resources your way for the undergraduate and graduate curriculum if you want to sort of go into those spaces. They're interesting and they're contemporary. So okay, I think I'm gonna sort of finish up. I don't know what else you guys want me to talk about. I just want to just mention a few things from a pedagogical perspective. My plan is to sort of mix up content. I've probably not going to do too much lecturing, or I'm going to keep my lecturing to small sort of tidbits when I think about this in the context of the fall. So my plan is to assign podcasts to assign case studies, to assign discussion sort of threads, as well as some documentaries, kind of a multimedia mix, less of me as a talking head. So I wanted to make sure you guys had access to all of those things that I'm thinking about in plugging in my own syllabus in the fall. So I'm happy to answer any questions for the remainder of our session today. And I'd love to hear from Sarah and Jasmine and Margaret, and Julia, not to put you on the spot, but if there are things that you're wondering about or thinking about.
Well, I did kind of have a question, and I think it relates really nicely to Natalie's question and all the discussion that was just happening. And I'll phrase it more of like, I guess, a statement or something that's been on my mind, but the differences between activism and advocacy also falling along the lines of like groups who have been marginalized have to be strategic about which they choose, because sometimes activism and radical tactics can reinforce some of the marginalization that they've experienced, and they have to kind of think through those things. And like, what's your experience with that in this specific, like, gender diversity context? That would be really helpful to hear.
Yeah, I think Nika and I can both speak to that. So let me just give you a little bit of context of the project itself. And I've got sort of multiple iterations of that that I'm working on sort of making sense of. So I conducted some interviews with folks that I am calling communicators. And the criteria was, they're doing some sort of strategic communication work. Often it doesn't get called public relations, but it is public relations within sort of its scope of work. And they identify as either trans or gender diverse. So that's sort of the bucket. The project Nika and I are working on specifically brings my sort of queer theory and her critical race theory together, and we're focusing on queer of color folks in that space. But the larger project at hand looks at sort of that population. And one sort of subset project I'm looking at with a graduate student and Nika is voice and listening. And the importance in thinking about amplifying and signal boosting. Those are two concepts that we apply to sort of the TGD, trans and gender diverse populations, and the ways in which certain groups utilize those techniques to amplify the voices of trans women of color, for example. So using their white trans privilege to elevate the voices of trans Black women that maybe haven't been elevated. So amplification and signal boosting, those are the two. Does that answer your question, Sarah?
Yeah, thank you. That's really, really helpful.
Yeah, and I think it depends on context, right? So if you're working, if it's a nonprofit organization that's about, that's more radical in its approach, that's one thing, but maybe you, if you're trying to tease out sort of the nuances around that, maybe a more conservatively oriented public opinion or public policy nonprofit organization that's working on, policy reform at the state level or the local level, right? That, yeah, it really depends on context.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say, first of all, thank you so much, Erica, for hosting this. I feel like I'm learning a lot, so thank you for that. I guess my two questions, and this is can be related to I think a lot of different topics as far as social justice that I've been thinking about. When you talked about language, this is the first question. When you talked about language earlier, I've had, just related to something that is maybe a little bit more familiar to me, I've had debates with other Black people about the language of saying Black Lives Matter versus saying, using some of these other terminologies, because the phrase is somewhat being co-opted, in certain ways. I've had conservative friends of mine tell me that, Black Lives Matter is like a terrorist organization and all of these things, and it's almost like besides the point. It's like you are making an issue of the wording versus actually dealing with the issues that Black people are actually wanting you to be concerned about. And so I wonder if there's similar concerns when it comes to terminology in the sexual minority space, and then is there any way from the academic standpoint to speak about it, because I feel like I'm speaking about it in really, you know, colloquial or common language. But is there a way to sort of tackle that? Like you're having a war of words, kind of, instead of it dealing with the point. Is there a way of saying that in a more eloquent way?
Yeah, that's a great point in terms of thinking about the naming of a movement and the implications that has in the ways that that movement resonates with its target audience, with its constituencies, with its external media properties that cover it, right? And you're exactly right with the ways in which the Black Lives Matter movement is being sort of represented and is being understood, right? I think that's a fantastic example. I'm trying to think of examples within sort of LGBTQ spaces. I'll have to think about that more. I mean, I think the word queer is a fantastic example of that. That's a word that people of certain generations will not even say. Because it is pejorative, because it is understood to be, right? And I got in a debate with a scholar who I don't know if he's even still alive. His name is Ed Alwood. He was at Quinnipiac University. I think he's retired, but he is a gay man. And I tried to sort of tease out some of the anxieties or unease he felt around the word queer in his scholarship, in his reporting. He was a journalism scholar who looked at the coverage of gay and lesbian sort of politics in the first, mid, and sort of end of the 21st century. So yeah. Thanks for that question, Jasmine. Okay, what's that, Julia? Oh, you were at that conversation, Natalie. I think I got really heated about that.
It got very heated, but the room was on your side, but it got very heated.
Yeah, and it was early on. I might have been a graduate student, so I didn't know what I was doing, but I was like fighting fire with, more fire.
One other quick question, this is, I guess, related, but is there a theory that I feel like I've come across it before that has to do with the person's threshold to change?
With what? I'm sorry, what was it?
A person's threshold to change. I know earlier we were talking about how there are all these points along the way where a person could be quote unquote activated. I feel like I've come across a theory that has to do with a person's threshold to change, where like you can only push a person so far, with in a certain time period or something like that. I just can't, it's not coming to me. I was trying to think of it.
I bet you're absolutely right, but that sounds more of like a calm theory. I don't dabble in that kind of space, but I bet that someone on this call might know that, or there might be in one of your public relations books, it might be in there. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comments and your questions. I appreciate it.
Eric, I've got a question about, I'm thinking about internal communications, employee relations, and whether you looked at all at some of these issues around, privacy, privacy of people in the workplace, but thinking about their particular needs and concerns and how to communicate internally, on some of these issues, or to at least be sensitive to these populations internally in an organization when you at the same time really want to respect people's privacy and desire to remain maybe somewhat like below the radar, or, for that, for the identity not to be in the forefront.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's a lot of stuff out there in the org com space around that. I know I've read several articles around folks' experiences maybe with transitioning, like, so, they're a transgender employee and they, the privacy and concerns around that. Certainly I know, I don't mean to say that, being a sexual minority, identifying as LGB, that doesn't, not that that's not socially taboo anymore, but I see the contemporary sort of around the trans space. Certainly I can pass along more resources for you. That you can certainly focus on employee resource groups, right? Identity employee resource groups, and what they do around that. There are some exemplars I talk about that in the American Airlines case study as well. Again, understanding that's from like the 90s, so it's different, but the history provides some context as to why a lack of protections or a lack of resources or a lack of things, what implications does that have? So yeah, I think the internal is often we don't give enough attention to it. But for me, and whenever I think about any identity specific sort of work, thinking about whether your internal and your external communication efforts and practices match up is super important in terms of congruency. And we're seeing that with, right, the contemporary sort of Black Lives Matter stuff, right? Yeah, you take a corporate stand on, you know, Black Lives Matter, but how about your boardroom, right? We've seen those memes, we've seen those threads going around. So same can be sort of applied to other historically marginalized groups or minority groups. Cool.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not quick, but in terms of the research that you and Nika are doing now, are you finding many people of color who identify or who are communicators in that space, queer communicators of color, or how do they enter into public relations? I guess my whole thing now is trying to figure out where are they coming from? Where are they jumping into this? If the positions aren't labeled as PR, if they're communications type positions, where are they coming from? What are their life scripts that get them to this point where they are actually doing PR or public relations, stratcom, whatever you want to call it? Are they coming out of our classrooms, or are they doing this because, where are they coming from? I'm just curious, like, what are their backgrounds, if you...
Okay. That's a great question. Nika, do you want to tackle it, or do you want me to start off and you can...
Well, I'll start and then I'm going to pass it over to you, because you're more of the SME in my opinion than I, but from the way I look at it, it seems like they are mostly coming to the profession out of their own needs, out of a need to be able to advocate or participate in activism activities on behalf of their communities. And then there was I think a couple that I came across that spoke about how the public relations classroom can become more friendly towards communicators who embody those positions and be supportive to them going up through what we maybe would describe more traditional ranks. But by and large, it appeared to me as if the majority of the people interviewed engaged in those activities because they wanted to, they had to, out of a desire to well represent their community, make sure they had the resources they needed, and so on. Is that consistent with what you would say, Erica?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would take it even one step further, and not just about making sure they're well represented, but make sure they're able to continue living. So in many cases, these communicators, these individuals are advocating or bringing light to, giving voice to the fundamental sort of legitimacy of queer, of color lives to exist.
Yeah.
To speak out against the murders of Black trans women, for example. So I think there's a spectrum, but I would overwhelmingly say no, they're not coming out of our classrooms. If they have college degrees, they're insignificant in our conversations, right?
Gotcha.
It's boots on the ground. It's out of their communication work. Certainly there are outliers to that, right? We did have a handful of folks who might have comm degrees or something like that, but overwhelmingly they've learned their skills and they've gained their knowledge on the streets, the proverbial streets, and the sort of, the ideological streets and the actual streets.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other thing. I'm grateful to Erica for inviting me into that project, but it really gave me a different view on communication to survive. Mm-hmm. Like, the right to live. I forgot the most important thing, the right to be accepted as a human being, the right to resources, food, water, the right to walk down the street safely without someone looking at you and thinking because you look different, you should die. On multiple sides, so I'll stop there. But yeah, I'm glad you said that. That was the most important thing, boots on the ground and mere survival.
Yeah, and I think that's really, it helps us trouble what we've thought about public relations historically, right? In terms of the narratives and the stories we tell about our discipline. And also it allows us to come up with more innovative, creative, and pressing solutions to the work we are doing in our classrooms.
And I applaud you all for doing that and for bringing that up, because I think it shows the gap between what we're doing versus who's actually doing it. And that's a tremendous thing that a lot of us, we're preparing a lot of students to go into agency work or corporate work, but not necessarily onto the ideological, actual, and what the streets you were just talking about, Erica. And I think that just shows a gap. And also, I don't know if anybody's interested in it, but life scripts as a theory, understanding how people come into the profession, not just in terms of agency, corporate, but also in terms of activism and through those routes, that's something that we really don't study. And we really don't have an understanding of how do people come to what we study and to what we do. So I think it's very valuable. And again, thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I've thought a lot about, so I'm new to that concept. It's not familiar to me, but I'll make note of it. I'm trying to really actively sort of trouble the guest speakers I bring into my class this semester as well, given our conversation around activism and public relations. And so rather than drawing from the typical crowd of practitioners from agencies, I've reached out to some of my friends who I know do comms work, but maybe they're doing it for like the Texas Civil Rights Project, right? And they're doing social media, or so it's not agency folks. And I've been really I'm trying to be very deliberate in the ways in which communication work can happen that's not agency, internship, plug and play, pipeline. So I encourage you guys to also do that. It requires a lot of work though. I mean, and transparency and vulnerability, because if you're trying to make connections with identity groups that are not something that you're familiar with or connected to already, there's trust and skepticism. So
a quick question, just a curiosity, top of mind answer. If they're doing more of this work sort of on the streets, and I like that that's the language that we're using, do we think that means there's more trial and error? Right? Like if they're not coming out of like a PR classroom where maybe they've done some of that trial and error in like a campaigns class, do we think that, does that increase that?
That is a really good question.
Or not?
I don't have, so I'm not speaking from the data right now. I'm speaking from my own thoughts. And I often see I'm not sure I'm gonna get the language right here, but when you're so close to the bottom, failure and fall, you have so little to lose. So I would say yes. My immediate sort of reaction is yes, but I don't have, it's not empirically granted. Sure. But yeah, I would think there's more, more willingness to fail.
But also too, there's fewer eyes possibly looking at you, so it doesn't feel like failure. It may not, it's different than being over the Red Cross social media account and you put that I'm slizzard on there.
Getting slizzard?
Yeah. That
I
old
deleted that post.
Yeah. It's different from doing that. And I think the capacity for failure, again, it's we have to reconceptualize what failure looks like in an activist standpoint and in a social movement than versus a corporation. So, your tweet only getting 5 retweets. Well, who's retweeting it? Whatever. But you have 15 people come to a march, or you have 15 people come to a meeting. That may be more valuable. So I think it's the recalibration of the terminology and the considerations we use too. in that as well. So I like that question though, because again, we have these terms and these ideas in PR that are so wrapped up in a very corporate mindset and a very corporate way of thinking, like failure. But what exactly does that look like in an activist organization? A failure means you have a death probably, or somebody went to jail. That's different than, you know, our intern screwed up. Oops.
Yeah.
We have to apologize.
We didn't get enough retweets. Yeah, very different.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So thinking about scale and scope, maybe.
Yeah.
Just put it in concrete terminology. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Cool. Also, just a brief off topic, a little bit. I dumped a couple of links into the chat because so where I'm at Memphis, I'm in a journalism and strategic media program. So one of the things that my students want to talk a lot about is like AP style and like, how do we write about this stuff? And I actually had a grad student do some research and I connected her with Erica on like the fact that AP style doesn't really have official designations for how to write about transgender individuals. And that leads to a lot of dead naming when especially when like their deaths are reported, which is not great, obviously. So HRC and where did I put it? LAD both have sort of some reference style stuff that they've kind of done on their own.
And the Trans Journalist Association just launched, I think, last month, and they have a style guide, as well as the National Lesbian Gay Journalism Association. They have a fabulous guide that I've used before too, and they're
awesome.
Super helpful. And I think there's a question in the chat from Nika. What's dead naming?
Yeah, Erica.
Got you. Erica got it. Okay.
Thank you, because I've never heard that before, but
Yeah, so if you look at like the historical, and this is another maybe for a PR writing class, if you want to talk about it. So the Brandon Tina case, when the media report, or many actually, it's just a very typical, it was a very typical practice. If a trans person was murdered, the journalists would call them by their birth assigned name or their, you know, pre-transition name or however, but not the name that they went by. And this is still happening. It's happening all the time, especially for trans women of color. You see it happening still. And thank you for suggesting that grad student. She reached out to me and is interested in applying to UT. So I would love to have a minion. I mean that in the nicest way possible.
I think she'd be a good minion. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, so, all right, y'all. Thank you very much for all your questions and your really productive, engaging thoughts today. I appreciate it. I'm going to make this, I'm going to share this with the larger group at hand. Is that all right with everyone? I know you asked questions, but is that okay? Okay. Great. Thank you guys. I'm happy to continue the conversation. If you're interested in you know, collaborating on any sort of pedagogical stuff or research, I'm always open to fielding any of those inquiries. So let me know. I tend to think I'm pretty receptive. I'm not scary, I don't think. And if you want me to prove you otherwise, I can put some music on and dance for you. It's fine. But in the meantime, thank you for everything. And I look forward to our next dialogue. I'm going to throw that back out. I don't know if there's anyone who's interested in August, but please do think about that and what that conversation might look like for August.
I was going to say, as sort of the unofficial secretary, I guess, I